Hello, my name is David Wilkins, and I am the current president of Manasota ASALA, which is our local branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Our mission at ASALA is to promote research, preserve, interpret, and disseminate information about Black life and history and culture to the global community. This series of 8 lectures on American slavery is a part of our fulfillment of that mission. And I'm happy to be able to present this to you. These classes were originally presented as a live course through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Ringling College, better known as OLLI, and I've recorded them for preservation and utilization of our members and friends. You can find this series of 8 classes, the first of which I'll deliver today, on our Manasota ASALA website. That is asala-manasotafl.org. And you will also find uh, a series on the Reconstruction era, which I taught and recorded earlier this year at the same location. There are actually 9 episodes of our Reconstruction series. So let me begin. Again, I think this is. Let me share my screen. Get up my slides. And so I've taught this class for about 3 years. I originally taught the class at Ringling, and you'll note I use as a subtitle, No, Mr. West, Slavery Was Never a Choice. Some of you will remember Kanye West, the rapper, now probably almost 4 years ago in an interview made the, I think, unfortunate statement in reference to slavery that slavery was a choice, and while the context is unimportant and we don't have time to go into it today, I use it as I think it reflects really the poor job we've done throughout our history in teaching American slavery and frankly, teaching any aspect of the African American story in the New World. My effort today is to try and correct that over this series of 8 lectures and whatever else Manasota ASALA can do in pursuant again of our mission. So let me get into my slides. Typically, we would have Q&A in the course, and the slide obviously indicates that. This is a presentation, and often I do it in front of an audience. This, of course, was done in 2020 between September and November during our COVID pandemics. Everything was done virtually, so I didn't have the benefit, which was unfortunate because I do much prefer to teach in front of a live audience. So the goal of my course is to help those who are interested understand how slavery created race, how it is really impossible for us to understand today, and the ongoing battles we have in grasping race and racism and white supremacy, because we have failed to understand the root of those principles, white supremacy and racism, which I would contend, and I believe we will show here, find their root in American slavery from the beginning. So the goal of the first class is really an overview. I'm going to begin looking at our syllabus and what we're going to cover over this 8 classes. And then we're going to begin with a brief discussion of a recent controversy. You'll remember in 2019, we celebrated the 400-year anniversary of the so-called first arrivals of Africans to the colonies that would become the United States. And so I'm going to spend a little time because I think it's instructive, it's timely. You may be viewing this in 2020, 2021, but hopefully you'll remember the controversy around the 1619 project. So let's get into that. I always begin this class with this photo of Whipped Peter. Slavery is hard history. And I take that phrase from materials that I also rely on quite heavily that were produced by the tolerance, teaching tolerance project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Hopefully you're familiar with Southern Poverty Law Center. If you're not, you need to be. They have produced a marvelous set of materials, podcast, a framework, all built around 8 core concepts that help us understand American slavery. They have also done remarkable work in helping us understand other aspects of African American history. I focused on their work on American slavery, and I commend it to you. It's exceptional. So that's the teaching art history is again a reference to their materials. I'll use some of that in our opener today. And again, we'll provide a link for your further study. I use the term enslaved rather than slave. Slave is an object, and enslaved man, woman, and child are people. And when we're trying to understand this history, we can never lose sight of the fact that we are talking about people. Part of the struggle here is helping Americans, helping those who study this history get comfortable with the very hard history, the hard truth of its brutality. So let me talk to you about the shocking photo of Whipped Peter. By the time he made it to a Union encampment in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in March of 1863, Peter had been through hell. Bloodhounds had chased him. He had been pursued for miles, had run barefoot through creeks and across fields. He had barely survived. When he reached the soldiers, Peter's clothing was ragged and soaked with blood, mud, and sweat. But his 10-day ordeal was nothing compared to what he had already been through. During his enslavement on John and Bridget Lyons's Louisiana plantation, Peter endured not just the indignity of slavery, but a brutal whipping that nearly took his life. And when he joined the Union Army after his escape from slavery, Peter exposed his scars during a medical examination. Raised welts and strafe marks crisscrossed his back. The marks extended from his buttock to his shoulders, calling to mind the viciousness and power with which he had been beaten. It was a hideous constellation of scars, visual proof of the brutality of slavery. And for thousands of white people, it was a shocking image that helped fuel the fires of abolition during the Civil War. Photo taken by Union soldiers while he was attended by Union physicians at a camp in controlled territory by the Union forces in the Civil War. The photo of Peter his back became one of the most widely circulated images of slavery of its time, galvanizing public opinion and serving as a wordless indictment of the institution of slavery. Peter's disfigured back helped bring the stakes of the Civil War to life, contradicting Southerners' insistence that their slaveholding was a matter of economic survival, not racism. And it showed just how important mass media was during the war that nearly destroyed the United States. So, why do I choose to study American slavery? I've been a student of American history all my life. I was a lawyer in my professional life. After retiring from my almost 40 years of law practice, I returned to reading American history, African American history. particularly, and I discovered some marvelous new scholarship in the area of American slavery, scholarship that didn't exist when I was studying at the university back in the 70s. I discovered some, as I said, some new scholarships. Ta-Nehisi Coates has written beautifully. We Were 8 Years in Power. I think 8 essays that he wrote while he was a writer for The Atlantic, one of which was entitled "Why More Blacks Don't Study the Civil War." In reading that, again, he encouraged me to go back to this area of the academy, and I've discovered some marvelous new resources. That's where I also discovered the teaching art history material I've talked about. And Hassan Kwame Jeffries, a Black scholar at the Ohio State University, has is the lead editor of the project, and again has written beautifully on the subject. Let me just read. This is from the opening, the preface to the monologue that the Southern Poverty Law Center has put together on teaching art history. This is Hassan Kwame Jeffries. It is often said that slavery was our country's original sin, but it is much more than that. Slavery is our country's origin. It was responsible for the growth of the American colonies, transforming them from far-flung, forgotten outposts of the British Empire to glimmering jewels in the crown of England. And slavery was a driving power behind the new nation's territorial expansion and industrial maturation, making the United States a powerful force in the Americas and beyond. Slavery was also our country's Achilles heel, responsible for its near undoing. When the Southern states seceded, they did so expressly to preserve slavery. So wholly dependent were white Southerners on the institution that they took up arms against their own to keep African Americans in bondage. They simply could not allow a world in which they did not have absolute authority to control Black labor and to regulate Black behavior. Jeffries continues, the central role that slavery played in the development of the United States is beyond dispute. And yet we, the people, do not like to talk about slavery or even think about it, much less teach it or learn it. The implications of doing so unnerve us. If the cornerstone of the Confederacy was slavery, then what does that say about those who revere the people who took up arms to keep African Americans in chains? James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, could hold people in bondage his entire life, refusing to free a single soul even upon his death. Then what does that say about our nation's founders, about our nation itself? Slavery is hard history. It is hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It is hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It is hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. And it is hard to learn about those who abided it. We, the people, have a deep-seated aversion to hard history because we are uncomfortable with the implication it raises about the past as well as the present. Again, opening piece by Jeffries to this wonderful set of materials that the Teaching Tolerance folks have put together. So what I want to accomplish, obviously, is to grapple with this hard history and to do it in as comprehensive way as possible over these 8 lectures. And I thought one good way to start, I'm going to build video clips into these lectures as much as I can, because you don't want to just hear me ramble on. But I've selected some that I think are particularly good. And let me play this one from another new scholar, who I hope you know, Ibram Kendi.
During this Black History Month, students around the nation are learning about icons of the civil rights movement. But beyond those lessons, a CBS News analysis found some major problems in the way that students are being taught about some very important moments in American history. Our national correspondent, Jerika Duncan, has been looking into this And so, Dorica, we've been promoting your story all morning long. I'm very curious to find out what you all found out.
We learned a lot. And what we found out is that how you learn about topics like slavery and the civil rights movement really depends on where you live and the textbooks you're using. And some of the textbooks we looked at, there's information that may surprise you. Is there a problem with how we teach American history in this country?
Yes.
Renowned scholar Dr. Ibram X. Kendi can't believe what students are learning about America's past.
Reviewing these texts closely, now I can see why so many students get to college and they're like, why didn't we learn this in high school? Because it isn't in these texts.
We asked Kendi, a CBS News contributor, to take a look at 4 textbooks used in public school classrooms. The first book, The American Pageant, is used to teach advanced placement history. The publisher of the book says more than 5 million students learn from it each year. We looked at the 16th edition of the book, published in 2016.
So here on page 346, it says, in the deeper South, many free blacks were mulattoes.
The term mulatto is a racist slur against biracial people.
The book also includes this map, referring to enslaved Africans in 1775 as immigrants, alongside the Dutch, the Scottish, and the German.
To refer to them again as immigrants insinuates that they chose to come. The African people who almost totally were forced to come and certainly did not want to come to the United States in chains.
Just to see if things have changed, we looked at the latest edition of the book published this year. The map is still there.
The assignment asked students to put a price on slaves.
What and how students learn about history is different everywhere and sometimes problematic.
The teacher, who is white, told them to write funny captions on images of freed slaves.
There are reports the teacher made black students act as slaves.
There is no national standard for what history is taught. Each state sets standards which outlines what students are expected to learn. CBS News took a look at the social studies standards for all 50 states and the District of Columbia. We found 7 states do not directly mention slavery, and 8 do not mention the civil rights movement. Only 2 states mention white supremacy, and 16 list states' rights as a cause of the Civil War, which Kendi says is a problem.
This was the term that the Confederate states, that later segregationists and even some slaveholders utilized to hide that they were really fighting for the rights as slaveholders.
Kevin Ellis is the chair of the Texas State Board of Education. About 10% of the nation's students attend a Texas public school. In 2018, the state changed its standards to teach slavery as the central cause of the Civil War, but it still mentions states' rights.
Should states' rights even be taught at all?
So I think even when you look at states' rights, it focused around slavery. And so what we're doing now is just being clear that those states' rights that the South was fighting over was states' rights for them to have slavery.
Kendi also took a look at this textbook, Texas History, which is adopted by the state to teach middle school social studies. It covers topics including slavery and the Civil War.
This is a picture, and the caption says, "Some U.S. settlers brought slaves to Texas to help work the fields and do chores." And, I don't think we should describe slave labor as chores.
A few pages later, Kendi pointed out this image.
The caption for this picture says, "What characteristics of slave life does this image show?" Does this depict slavery?
If we were going to have a single picture that depicted slavery, it should be a picture that demonstrates terror and violence.
We also asked Ellis what he thought about the picture.
Well, I think one of the, as we go through the struggles and the injustices that the slaves went through, I think the important thing is not to do what was done in earlier times and make it sound like they were better off here than they were back in their.
But this picture doesn't look so bad. There's no marks on anyone's body, and this is supposed to represent enslaved people.
I think the point that's being made is the fact this was not a true representation of what slaves went through and the injustices that they went through. And I can't answer why that made it in that textbook. We have progressed in the past 5 years and 10 years and 20 years, and we still have more work to do. And I think this would be an example of that.
The publisher of that Texas history book, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, told CBS News in a statement that it appreciates and values Dr. Kendi's analysis of the textbook, and they are making intentional changes to the content in future editions. Cengage, the publisher of the American Pageant, said the authors work strenuously to provide an accurate, fair, and engrossing account of American history, and they are always striving to improve. They note the newest edition makes corrections and includes firsthand accounts from African Americans of the time. So
important to point out, though, that the publishers can make these changes, but it's up to the states to adopt them.
it's up,
States can
it's up
reject
to the
it.
states. And,
Right.
you know, it's funny because I talked to a girlfriend of mine, her daughter's in high school, and she just got an A in her U.S. history class. And I told her about this story, and she said, we have to teach them. It's up to the parents. And I think there is sort of this unsaid thing, even especially in Black communities, that you're going to learn it from your family and not necessarily rely on the school to do it. Just because you look at these changes that they've made, this is in the last 5 years.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's very recent. Well, it's the most alarming thing you said in that story was that there were 7 states where slavery is not even
Or
mentioned.
civil rights. That's
Right.
what I find so jaw-dropping.
Yeah.
And I think when you're a kid, you're reading the textbook, it doesn't occur to you to challenge it. You
Right.
need a story like this to let you know.
Yes.
And it's also unfortunate, I think, many times in the Black community, not really knowing our history. I
Right.
think that is a problem.
Well,
It
if
is
the
a
schools
problem.
aren't teaching it, sometimes it's hard to know it.
It's very, very difficult. Right, Trika, that was very informative. Thank you.
So I start with the class with this video clip because I think, again, the real work has to happen in our schools. The textbooks being used by our schools, the standards that are poorly written or non-existent on the subject. And I just thought this clip captures that well. Ibram Kendi is the author of Stamped from the Beginning. Again, one of these this new class of really excellent scholarship, and Kendi does a marvelous job of taking us really to the very beginning of the presence of Africans in what would become the United States, but he also provides the context of some key players in that process and helps us understand again how racism was created in this experience to continue the profitability of slavery, which we're going to look at certainly through this class. I find it fascinating that in 2020, this textbook was still struggling with the identification of enslaved men, women, and children as immigrants. The teaching tolerance material also does an excellent job of both providing some information on the state standards. They have done surveys of students, surveys of teachers. They also survey, I believe, as many as 20 states and the standards that apply. So again, anyone interested in understanding this subject from the perspective of our educational system, I encourage you, Teaching Tolerance, go to teachingtolerance.org, and you'll find that material. It is well worth your time. Okay, let's move into the syllabus really quickly. These dates obviously relate to the class that I taught between September and November 2020. The syllabus doesn't change, so ignore the dates. But what I propose to do today, again, intro and overview, why I think it's so important that we study slavery, we study Reconstruction, we study the Civil Rights era, we study the role that African people of African descent played in the New World. Because unless we do that and unless we understand the institutions built to support both slavery and the experience of Black people after slavery, we then can't understand why there are still institutional dynamics that create harm and inequality for people of color today. So we're going to look at the origins of racism, Africa before the explorers, the presence of people of African descent who accompanied the conquistadors and the explorers to the New World. We're going to look at the role that Spain played, and Portugal, obviously, in the 14th and 15th centuries, as we conclude today. In the next segment, happened to be October 5th, we're going to look at Jamestown, the Massachusetts colony that we all remember from our early American history class. And we're going to look at how the presence of people of African descent impacted that colony, and how the colony and ultimately the rest of the colonies would react to preserve what they would discover to be a very profitable enterprise called slavery. We'll look at laws that would be passed after several years of the presence of Black people to essentially institutionalize slavery and distinguish it from the indentured servitude that had existed prior to that time. Slavery is going to become hereditary, and there's some unique aspects of slavery in the American experience, different from slavery elsewhere in antiquity in the rest of the world, that we'll focus on. We'll look at Bacon's Rebellion, particularly important, I think, touchstone in the change from the indenture system to race-based slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, the movement of as many as 12 million Africans from Africa to the New World. The horrible Middle Passage, hopefully that's a term that's familiar to you. We will spend some time looking at this most horrendous part of this slavery experience. And then we'll do some contrasts between slavery in the North and South, and emphasize, much to the surprise of many, that slavery existed in all of the 13 colonies. And it was only after the Revolutionary War that would change, but change very slowly. In the third installment, we'll look at resistance. And I should have emphasized the point, as the folks at Teaching Tolerance do very well, that enslaved people resisted in every way possible, both violently and non-violently, but resistance was an ongoing, ever-present dynamic that created obviously great tension for the enslaver. And we'll look at some examples, the Stonal Rebellion being one. There were a number of key rebellions that we'll focus on. The Maroons, this group of enslaved people they were runaways essentially, and we'll examine how they would join together with indigenous people throughout the era. The Revolutionary War and the creation of the new country through that war, the creation of the Constitution at the 1787 convention, and how it protected slavery. We'll look at freedom suits, a new book published very, very recently on this subject. There were, in fact, in the North, places like Boston, Philadelphia, suits brought by enslaved people, building off the spirit of enlightenment and freedom movements around the world. And we will always try to spend some time looking at the impact of slavery in these different time periods on the Black family. In the fourth episode, we'll look at how in the North, again, after the Civil War, gradual emancipation will take place. I said it will be slow, but it does happen, so much so that by certainly the Civil War, slavery has ended in much of the North. Slavery is going to grow, as we will examine at the same time in the South, as cotton becomes a more important commodity, indeed the most valuable commodity in the world. It will be that tension between abolishing slavery in the North, and indeed the fact that slavery has become essential to the economy of the South and to much of the market in the world that will drive the country toward war. The Haitian Revolution, very, very important as cotton becomes more important, the need for more land becomes more important, and it will again drive the Haitian Revolution will result in the Louisiana Purchase, and that will open up new land for the cultivation of cotton and other crops, therefore making it again a increasingly valuable proposition for the South, and adding to the tension that's going to lead, as I said again, to the Civil War. We'll then look at the expansion of slavery, the rebellions that will take place in the mid 1800s. I mentioned the Louisiana Purchase, a direct result of the Haitian Revolution. Napoleon will abandon his dreams of empire in the New World and will sell the Louisiana Purchase, which is, again, will double the size of the US. So when we talk about the Louisiana Purchase, we're not obviously talking about just the area that would become the state of Louisiana. The War of 1812, we'll look at that war, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the reality that Black folks fought in each of those contests over the objections of most of the white leadership at the time, until the demands of the war was such that Black soldiers were enlisted and performed brilliantly. And we'll look at the different motivations of the Black soldiers in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and then ultimately in the Civil War. Colonization and the drive to end slavery only would become more intense. The abolition movement would become more of a thorn in the sides of the enslavers. And we'll look at the role of the church, the Great Awakening, this movement in the early to mid 19th century, with again the desire to Christianize the Black community. The Black church would evolve separate from that movement, but they are certainly related, and we'll examine how and whether that was going to have a lasting impact both on Black and white parishioners. And again, there's some key slave rebellions in this era. In our sixth segment, I mentioned the importance of cotton. We will see the movement again as slavery becomes more important, more valuable to the economy of the South. You will see enslavers in mid-America, so in the Chesapeake Bay, in Maryland, Virginia, will begin to sell their enslaved men, women, and children as being more valuable than the cotton, or excuse me, the tobacco crop that was going to be raised. And you see a second Middle Passage. So as many as 1 million men, women, and children of African descent would be moved, forcibly marched from the Mid-South to the Lower South to meet the demands of King Cotton. Several important compromises: the Missouri Compromise, 1820, trying to maintain balance between the admission of slave states and free states. That compromise would fail, as would all compromises entered into to try to avoid the unfortunately inevitable cataclysm that would be the Civil War. Andrew Jackson in The Manifest Destiny will look at his Indian removal policy and its horrendous impact on indigenous peoples. There is an aspect of this class, so the enslavement of indigenous people. When I redo this class, I'm going to do a much better job. Again, scholarship in this area is improving every year. A recently published award-winning book The Other Slavery by Andres Resendez. I'm just getting into that, but he talks both about the reality of the enslavement of Indian peoples from the very beginning by the Spanish, by the Portuguese, and both in the colonies that would become the United States, in the southwestern part of North America that was controlled by the Spanish, and all throughout the Caribbean and South America. All of these areas obviously were populated by indigenous peoples, all of whom would be enslaved by the Europeans, and populations devastated as a result. So we'll look at, as much as we can, that aspect. But Resendez also points to the role that some indigenous enslavers who happen to be located in the Southeast would play. And so he has, again, both that interesting tension where there were enslaved Indians, but there were also Indians who were enslavers as heads of large tribes. And so we'll examine that. And in the last two segments, we're going to look at the time leading up to the Civil War. So an increasingly radical abolition movement, David Walker's Appeal. We're going to look at some of the language, a young Black freeborn man who will write a famous appeal, essentially calling for a Black uprising. The Liberator, William Lord Garrison's abolitionist paper. Garrison would be a obviously very well-known abolitionist, but also a friend and mentor to Frederick Douglass, who will emerge at this time as the great Black orator, formerly enslaved man, author, orator, great advocate on behalf of Black people. And so again, we're going to continue to see how slavery expands in the South. There's another compromise of 1850, that will again attempt to tamp down these threats of war between the South and the North. With particular emphasis, we'll look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That will all but certainly determine the fate of the country with the very draconian new law that's put in place. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, again, all of these efforts to find a way to peaceably bring new territories, estates in, and to account for the demands for more land, for slavery, and the tension that would create with particularly these territories who did not want both to allow slavery, also did not want to allow people of African descent into their states. So an interesting dynamic there. We'll conclude our eighth session looking at a very, very important Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott. Supreme Court essentially saying Black folks are not citizens, people of African descent are not citizens, therefore not entitled to sue in court for freedom, indeed not entitled essentially to being free. That's going to just add, again, more fuel to this fire that is going to become the Civil War. John Brown, the Harper's Ferry attempted revolution. Hopefully you're familiar with that. We'll spend a little bit of time there. The election of Lincoln, which would drive the South, beginning with South Carolina, to secede, followed by the other southern states that would become the Confederacy. We won't spend a lot of time on the war, but we will talk about the fact that Black men were absolutely pivotal to the Northern effort. Indeed, by the 1864-5 timeframe, Lincoln would have become convinced that winning the war would be impossible without the involvement of Black soldiers. And indeed, I'd make the case that while Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and then supported policies that would obviously lead to the end of the war, it would indeed the almost 200,000 formerly enslaved and free people of men of color who would fight for the Union and essentially free themselves from slavery. So let me begin. I said I wanted to spend some time talking about this 1619 project. Again, this is the commemoration of the 400th year anniversary of the first recorded sale of people of African descent in the British colonies that would become the United States. So the project is the project of the New York Times. Hopefully you're familiar with it. It's still available. The Times published a multi-part series on American slavery that positioned the institution at the center of American history and as foundational to that history, as foundational as Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead writer for the project, would say, as foundational as the proceedings in 1776. Let me read just a bit from the project, and we'll talk some more about, I think, its importance and some of the controversy that would spring up as a result of it. This is from the intro to the project. 1619, it is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, we were to tell you that this fact, which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, is wrong, and that the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August 1619? Though the exact date has been lost to history, it has come to be observed on August 20th. That was when a ship arrived at Point Comfort in the British colony of Virginia, bearing a cargo of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. Their arrival inaugurated a barbaric system of chattel slavery that would last for near 250 years. This is sometimes referred to as the country's original sin, but it is more than that. It is the country's very origin. Language is very similar to that of Hassan Kwame Jeffries from the Teaching Tolerance Project. The opening note continues. Out of slavery and the anti-Black racism it required grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, diet, popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. The seeds of all that were planted long before our official birth date of 1776, when the men known as our founders formally declared independence from Britain. The goal of the 1619 Project, a major initiative from the New York Times that this issue of the magazine inaugurates, is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as the nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. So that's really the controversy here, is the repositioning 1619 as our true founding, and to place, as Jake Silverstein, the editor in this note, suggests a rethinking of how we view ourselves. So the project was met with great excitement and fanfare in the general population and among scholars, but it was not without its critics. A group of 5 well-respected academic historians challenged the projects, leading to a number of scholarly debates in the academy and in academic publications. And these are still, again, available easily, Googling simply the 1619 Project controversy. And there are some well-written pieces on both sides of the debate, again, by well-recognized scholars. The project also attracted the attention of critics in the political arena, including Senator Tom Cotton, who has introduced legislation to stop funding to any school systems that teach the 1619 Project or use the curriculum published as part of the project. Like teaching tolerance, the 1619 Project provides an accompanying set of curriculum materials as well as podcast, and it again, I think it's all very well done. You can argue with the premise of the reframing of 1619 versus 1776, but if one can overcome that debate and get into the content of the material, there's great value, I believe. So Cotton, according to Cotton, again, this is Senator Tom Cotton, he says we have to study history, the history of slavery and its role and impact on the development of our country, because otherwise we can't understand our country. Fair enough statement, Senator Cotton, we would agree. He says, as the founding fathers said, it was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built. But the Union was built in a way, as Lincoln said, to put slavery on the course to ultimate extinction. So this is where I think Cotton got himself in trouble trying to be the historian as opposed to the politician. He says, as the founding fathers said, it was the necessary evil. Well, indeed, by the time that the founders, or certainly at the time of the Civil War, the so-called founders or leading fathers, certainly those who supported slavery, were arguing that slavery was indeed a positive good. It had been perhaps a necessary evil in the eyes of people like Jefferson and Franklin, because they were struggling to understand a country without Africans. What would you do with these enslaved men, women, and children? Would you return them to Africa? And if not, maintain them here? How would you do that safely after having abused generations of these people? And so that's where the concept of the necessary evil comes from. But this concept of positive good that Cotton missed completely turns that whole argument around, recognizing that this has become a profitable, dominant part of American society, and the economy was dependent upon it. Therefore, it's now become a positive good, both for us as the consumers of these benefits, but also for the Africans, because it's better that they're here becoming Christianized as opposed to being in Africa, exposed to all that savagery and uncivilization. So shortly after Cotton's public rebuke of the project, this is the other part of the objection. Yale professor Sean Willents, the leader of a group of 5 historians who critiqued the project, published a stern critique of Cotton's views. So Willents is best known for writing brilliantly on the subject. He is a leading scholar, modern scholar of American slavery and American history. Has written about the Constitution, and I'll make some reference to his materials later on. But he's now critiquing Cotton in an article, what Tom Cotton gets so wrong about slavery and the Constitution. In short, Willents rejected Cotton's view that the founders saw slavery as a necessary evil. Some thought it was evil, and some pro-slavery planters argued correctly that the South's economy could not survive without slavery. Other lower South farmers argued that slavery was a necessary good, as I pointed out earlier. James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution, rejected the idea of building a union on slavery and worked hard to avoid any mention of the practice in the document. When we get, I believe, in the third class, we'll talk about the discussion of slavery at the 1787 Constitutional Convention. And indeed, there was no mention of slavery as such in the Constitution. The founders found ways around that. So seeing a political opportunity, the current resident of the White House has begun campaigning against the leftist conspiracy to indoctrinate our children with radical interpretations of our history, and has even launched what he calls the 1776 Project. So this is a reference to Donald Trump, who picks up on Tom Cotton's criticism. I would be interested to know if Trump has read any of this material. But for him, it's an opportunity to play to his base and to try and create this impression that leftists and communists have taken over the academy and are threatening to destroy our children in their understanding. Let me just read again a bit more from this is again from the opening segment of the Teaching Tolerance material, and it's the intro by David Blight. Blight, a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, also from Yale, most recently the author of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, and he is a consultant to the Teaching Tolerance Project. His views. He was not one of the 5 historians who supported Wilentz in his critique of 1619, but I thought his comments on slavery particularly important in understanding this proposal that we reframe our founding as 1619. David Blight says, slavery is not an aberration in American history. It is at the heart of our history, a main event, a central foundational story. Slavery is also ancient. It has existed in all cultures and at all times. Slavery has always tended to evolve in circumstances of an abundance of land or resources and a scarcity, and therefore demand for labor. It still exists today in myriad forms the world struggles to fight. The difference in the 21st century is that virtually all forms of trafficking and enslavement today exist in a world where they are illegal. For the 2.5 centuries in which American slavery evolved, the systems of slavery operated largely as thoroughly legal practice, buttressed by local law and by the United States Constitution. Blight goes on, he says, of all the reasons or justifications used to enslave other human beings, race was late to the long story. Racial slavery came out of the epoch of the slave trade, which of course lasted 4 centuries in the Atlantic and likely longer in the Indian Ocean. That said, teachers need to know more of how to tell that story, of why slavery became racial in the Americas and then in the United States. Slavery was not born racial as some kind of original sin. It was made so by people in historical time. Slavery has its roots economic, social, moral, religious, political, and yes, racial. All can be taught to young people because they can see similar impulses today. This report, again referring to the Teaching Hard History report from Teaching Tolerance, this report calls on all involved to learn and teach the history of white supremacist ideology, which provides one of the deep roots of slavery. As writer Ta-Nehisi Coates argued in 2015, race is the child of racism, not the father. He says we have a problem of race because we have such a long history of making it, of demonstrating how adaptive theories of racial superiority have been to those who would exploit them. And let me read, I know this is lengthy, but it's important. Again, it gets to this question of how do we reposition our thinking about slavery, and then how do we teach it to our children? He says, this is David Blight again concluding, for young people, it is essential that in learning about this difficult subject, we help them understand that very little about history is determined. History does not happen because of prescriptions etched into our lives and behavior. As humans, we do have many disturbing habits and tendencies, but history is also full of great change. Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, wrote Martin Luther King Jr. Change comes because we make it come. The history of slavery is not merely a depressing subject about exploiters and victims, racist and heroic heroic survivors. It is all of those things, but also a great place to begin to understand our human condition, our nation's foundations and legacies, all around us with which we live every day. Slavery helped make America, to build it, and through cataclysm, its destruction made possible remaking America. Again, interesting debate among historians, but also important as we try to help our children understand. So let me just wrap up this opening section on the 1619 project, recognizing again there's a great deal of controversy. Nicole Hannah-Jones, as I said, was sort of the lead writer, staff writer, won a Pulitzer for commentary for this work. She says our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written. Black Americans fought to make them true. Without this struggle, America would have no democracy at all. So some have suggested that the criticism of the project is based as much on Jones's forthright proclamations of primacy of American slavery to the founding of the nation as it is of the accuracy of the historical record presented in the 10 essays and 17 literary works that comprise the project. It may be instructive that the 5 dissenting historians were unable to recruit a larger number of academics to join them in their campaign. I imagine some refused because they disagreed with the critics, while some may have refused to assail such a timely and ambitious and much needed exploration of this critical component of our American experience. Over interpretations or disagreements that should not be allowed to diminish the significant benefit the project offered to our understanding of ourselves and our history. Again, there were 5 well-respected lead critics to the project, and we could spend more time on the specifics of their criticisms. That's available to you online. I commend you to read and instruct yourself. I also commend this 1619 project. It is again compilation of very well done, well thought out, I think fact-based analysis on how do we position Africans in America as we think about our history and its implications for today. Let's take a pause here. And again, you're seeing this not with a live audience, but I'm going to just take a break and then we'll pick up again. This is where we would typically take questions. And by the way, for any of you who are reviewing this and have questions, please use our ASALA website to send those questions to me, and we'll get answers. And I should also invite you to join ASALA. It is a wonderful organization of about 350 folks who live full or part-time in Manatee, Bradenton, Sarasota, and it's open to all who love history and are interested to understand the history of Black folks in this country. Okay, let's move quickly through again, sort of slavery in world history. It's important. I think David Blight made the point in the passages I read from him. Slavery did not begin in the colonies that would become the U.S. And so I want to spend a little bit of time providing perspective here. To begin to say, by saying slavery has always existed in every society, everywhere in the world. Men have enslaved other men. Now, I did say there was some unique characteristics to slavery in those colonies that would become America, but slavery has always existed. In the ancient world, those of you who have studied the Bible, you know the many references to slaves in the Old Testament and in the New. I think of the curse of Ham and the various theories that people have used to justify the enslavement of Africans. The curse of Ham being the curse that Noah placed, of course, not on Ham, but on his son Cain. Not, Cain is the wrong word, wrong son. Canaan, and of course the world has taken that, the enslaver world has taken that to justify that was a curse put on Black people. There is, anyway, we won't spend time on how ludicrous that is, but understand that there will always be those who try to justify contemporaneously and even today slavery on that basis. There were theories, the climate theory, that indeed the sun both turned people close to the equator dark, and that darkness created some lack of capacity, and that once these equator bound folks moved to the north, that they could become white, also smarter, more capable. And then there were the theories, monogenesis and polygenesis, that indeed, again, from a biblical perspective, Adam and Eve, all men come from Adam and Eve. That's the monogenesis theory. Polygenesis would argue that there were in fact more than one original origins, and Black people being that other group. In the Middle Ages, you see Europe as they encounter other peoples, Muslims, Jews, Africans. They're again, slavery was existing in all of these societies. Indeed, we'll look at slavery in ancient Rome, ancient Greece. And as we will see, typically those other forms of slavery were the result of someone defeated in a war, or someone jailed for a crime, or unable to pay their debts, and they would become slaves, but treated again very differently than the slavery we're going to see in the colonies. We'll look at the age of exploration, the fact that Europeans, particularly beginning with the Portuguese and the Spanish, would enslave on contact. Sort of first contact, the Europeans to the New World, they would enslave indigenous people, and those indigenous people will find died at extraordinarily high rates for a number of reasons. And then obviously we'll get into slavery in the New World in the colonies. So I thought as we're thinking about this thinking of color, and how we understand race today, white supremacy today, in the context of this, one of the early thinkers that would influence scholars and scholarship throughout really the 19th and 20th century. So John William Burgess, Columbia University would become really the father of a school of historiography known as the Dunning School. But this is one of his early statements, and if we understand again that this is an influencer to the scholars who would follow, Columbia being a leading school for historians in the 17th, 18th, or 18th and 19th century. So Burgess says the claim that there is nothing in the color of the skin from the point of view of political ethics is a great sophism. A black skin means membership in a race of men, which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never therefore created any civilization of any kind. I include this, again, he is an influential American scholar of the 19th century. He studies history at Amherst, graduating in 1867, and then would go on to study in Germany. In 1876, he would begin his long career at Columbia, and he'd have great influence on William Dunning, William Archibald Dunning, and Dunning will go on and then teach a generation of historians. It's striking that a historian would have absolutely no understanding of the history of Africa, of the kingdoms and the societies that long existed, long predated European civilization and certainly New World civilization. Again, there is great scholarship. There's a book before they came before Columbus, which I'm also reading. When I redo this class, I'll include more and probably add an additional hour, 2 hour segment on the subject. But it's instructive that this influential thinker had absolutely no understanding or appreciation for the great societies that existed before Europe essentially had come out of the Stone Age. And it helps us understand why we struggle today with this kind of understanding. I thought it important to also, so this is Andrew Johnson, the 17th president of the United States. And he, notoriously racist, he would assume the presidency after Lincoln's death and would almost single-handedly cripple the efforts at Reconstruction. He was a former enslaver himself. Lincoln would bring him into the cabinet, hoping again to mollify. He was from Tennessee, mollify the Mid-South, if not some of the Southerners. Uh, I don't think Lincoln had a true understanding of the depth of Johnson's racism. But again, just to share with you the thinking of some key players in our history that would influence society, certainly in the 19th century, and would obviously impact policy through the 20th century. So this is Johnson. His third annual address to Congress, December 3rd, 1867. But if anything can be proved by known facts, Johnson would say, if all reasoning upon evidence is not abandoned, it must be acknowledged that in the progress of nations, Negroes have shown less capacity for government than any other race of people. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. Again, um, so how could a US president know nothing of the history and accomplishments of ancient African civilizations? It's one thing to be ignorant of those historical facts. It's another to promote them as true. And again, it's this kind of thinking that drives scholarship in this era and for eras to come, and would impact what we teach our teachers, and then what those teachers would teach our children, and arguably are teaching them today. I just share this. There's another great resource. This is from a podcast by Bonnie Greer. She does a marvelous job. In Search of Black History is the source. And I just took this one statement from her as I listened to her podcast in preparation for the class. She says, history is meant to be the story of us all, the definitive human story, but it isn't, and it never was. History in the end is the story of those who wrote it. They own it. History is written by the victors, as Churchill, or at least this comment attributed to Churchill. So as we think about statements like Johnson's or the other historian I cited, we understand that these are people in power, and power is in a position to tell the story. And if that story is degrading to a group of people for whom there is benefit for their degradation, such as those in favor of slavery, then it helps put in context why there's such broad ignorance and misunderstanding. So let me spend the rest of our time talking about some of these African civilizations, and recognizing my own ignorance as I've gotten into this study. I've got much more to learn, and someday may do a class on African, or the history of Africa. But let's just listen to someone, Henry Louis Gates. I hope that's a familiar name to you. Great scholar who's done some marvelous work in this area.
Next, a preview of a new PBS documentary series, Africa's Great Civilizations. Audie Cornish of NPR's All Things Considered has our look.
The history of the African continent, home to 15% of the world's population, remains a mystery for many. Historian and Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. admits in his youth it was a place he rarely considered. Now he has a new PBS documentary series that reveals great moments in the continent's pre-colonial history. It's called Africa's Great Civilizations. He joins me now to discuss that work. Henry Louis Gates Jr., welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
So you've tackled all kinds of African American history, but this goes all the way back, way back to cave paintings. So what was the genesis of this idea?
I wanted to do a comprehensive history of Africa. And this is it. Been thinking about it for 5 years. Took us a year to shoot. We went to 12 African countries. And it's exhilarating. 6-hour series on 200,000 years of African history. When I was growing up, Africa was a place to be avoided, even for Black people. Our images of Africa came from Tarzan and Ramar and Sheena of the jungle. And we were embarrassed about Africa.
Yes, you talked about the effort to kind of distance, right? It was used as an insult within the community.
You Black African? Oh my God, that was like the N-word. But all that changed for me. It began to change in 1960 when I was 10 years old and 17 African nations became independent. And I had a very smart geography teacher, Mr. McHenry, our only male teacher. And he was very much into current events. And I was very much into being a good student. And a lot of the current events featured these emerging new African countries. And so I memorized romantic sounding rhythmic names like Moise Chambe and Patrice Lumumba and Mogadishu, words like that. And I became fascinated with Africa, slowly but surely making my way to Africa when I was 19 years old.
I think we can hear that in your introduction. I want to play a clip of that.
Okay. Africa is the home of the world's most ancient civilizations. Far too often, Africa has been thought of as isolated and static, but nothing could be further from the truth. The roots of every family tree trace here to Africa. And so does the history of civilization. In this series, we'll be going on a journey through 200,000 years of history. We'll explore great cities built along Africa's extensive trade networks, discover art of unparalleled beauty and technical brilliance, and marvel at thousands of years of breathtaking architecture.
What struck me watching this is that you use words like merchants and trade and engineering. It seemed like you were really trying to stress the achievements here. Mm-hmm. Why do you think those achievements have been obscured?
I think the achievements of Africans have been obscured, first of all, because of slavery. 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean between the 16th century and the 19th century. 12.5 million Africans shipped to enslavement in the New World. And then, after 1884, was the conference in Berlin, when European powers sat down, looked at an empty map of Africa and basically carved it up like you carve up a pizza pie. And they go, you're Spain, what do you want? You're Italy, what do you want? You're England, what do you want? You're King Leopold, he personally got the Congo. So they had to create a fiction of Africa as an empty place or a static place full of primitive people who were stuck in time. And those were ostensibly our ancestors. But the pre-colonial world knew all about Africa. There wasn't a moment really since the ancient Egyptians when Northern Africa, the Mediterranean world, and the larger world was not in touch with African civilizations, with some part of Africa. The Red Sea was a highway. The Nile was a highway. The Sahara was a highway, particularly after the domestication of camels, and the Indian Ocean highways. The emperor of Great Zimbabwe ate off porcelain plates that came from China. That's the 13th century. I mean, it's incredible. Most of Europe's gold between 1000 AD and 1500 AD came from West Africa. All of our history was stolen from us. We were robbed of the history because Europeans wanted to justify an economic order which depended upon our ancestors' exploitation.
It's almost as though you are taking these stories out of the footnotes of history and elevating them.
It's an excellent metaphor. We need for the facts of African and African American history to be a normal, naturalized part of the curriculum, to be moved from the footnotes up into the text. Black History Month is great, but we need every day to be Black History Month. And what's that mean? When you take a course in the history of civilization, Africa should be there as well. And I'm not talking about mythic claims that won't stand scholarly scrutiny. I mean facts about the history of the world, which every educated person should know about. Knowing your history is empowering, and Africa stands poised on the birth of a resurgence, a new renaissance. As you said, 15% of the world's population lives on the great African continent. And knowing about this rich and splendid history will be crucial to the individual self-esteem of every African and to the collective, as it were, sense of itself of the African people.
Henry Louis Gates Jr., thank you so much for speaking with us about this project.
Thank you for having me on the program.
The series runs tonight, tomorrow, and Wednesday at 9 p.m.
Hopefully Gates is familiar to you. Again, he's done a number of remarkable series like this one for PBS. So you may know him from PBS. But you should also know he is, again, one of these contemporary scholars of African American, African history. So I like to start this segment by making reference to this particular project of his and recommending it to you. And I particularly like his question, the question of our history being stolen. So the history of Africans and people of African descent being stolen. And it begs the question, why? And he answers the question simply because it was economically beneficial. That as we will see in the American experience, it was justification to continue a system of economic exploitation that was simply too profitable to turn away from. And therefore, let's erase the history of these people. Let's ignore that history and bury that history because clearly people who we are now enslaving could not have a history that demonstrates their excellence and their building of great societies prior to the transatlantic slave trade. There are a number of these ancient societies I could include here. I did mention they came before Columbus, so the African presence in ancient America. This is Ivan van Sertima, an old book actually, so it's not one of the new bits of scholarship, but he, much better than I can do in this short class, goes into the fact that Africans traveled to the New World long before Europeans did, and he's got I think some great information. But how is that possible if you are coming from a society that has been described as backward and uncivilized? How could you travel across the Atlantic or other places in the ancient world? So let's begin. I just want to talk just a bit about a couple of examples. So this is ancient Kush. Though often overshadowed by its Egyptian neighbors to the north, the kingdom of Kush stood as a regional power in Africa for over 1,000 years. The ancient Nubian Empire reached its peak in the second millennia BC, when it ruled over a vast swath of territory along the Nile River in what is now Sudan. Almost all that is known about Kush comes from Egyptian sources, which indicate that it was an economic center that operated a lucrative market in ivory, incense, iron, and especially gold. The kingdom was both a trading partner and military rival of Egypt. It even ruled Egypt in the 25th dynasty, and it adopted many of its neighbors' customs. The Kushites worshipped some of the Egyptian gods, mummified their dead, and built their own types of pyramids. The area surrounding the ancient Kushite capital of Meroe is now home to the ruins of over 200 pyramids, more than in Egypt. Between 170 BCE and 340 CE, Kush was ruled by women, known as the Candaces of Meroe, or Kandaki in Meroitic. The Kandaki would extend the power and influence of Kush through trade in ivory, gold, and horses. The Kandaki, following the lead of the king Ergamenes, moved Meroitic culture away from Egypt and the political influence of the cult of Amun. Under the Kandaki, Kush developed its own unique language and fortified its military. Under Queen Amaranis, Kush held its ground against Augustus Caesar and his Egyptian legions in the Meroitic War. In response to Kushite raids into Roman Egypt, the Roman prefect attacked Napata in 22 BCE. Amaranis countered this attack and ultimately negotiated favorable terms for peace and increased trade with Rome. Terms of the treaty between Rome and Kush required the return of statuary seized by the Kushites, especially statues of Caesar. Kush returned most, but retained the head of one statue of Augustus. The head was buried at the entry of the queen's palace, requiring Kushites to step on Augustus's head upon entering her presence. The head was excavated during an archaeological dig in Sudan and is on display in the British Museum today. I mentioned in opening this section Bonnie Greer, In Search of Black History. She does a marvelous job of telling the story of the Kandaki women. And isn't it interesting that in the British Museum today, we find archaeological evidence, so historians would call primary source evidence of the reality of empires such as Kush. Meroe, again, more than 200 more. I think the statement was more than 200. Sure, I've got that right. More than 200 pyramids, more than all of Egypt. So pretty impressive. Mali, again, just on the West African coast as an example. The founding of the Mali Empire dates to 1200, when a ruler named Sundiata Keita, sometimes called the Lion King, led a revolt against a Sasso king and united his subjects into a new state. Under Keita and his successors, the empire tightened its grip over a large portion of West Africa and grew rich on trade. Its most important cities were Djinn and Timbuktu, both of which were renowned for their elaborate adobe mosque and Islamic schools. One such institution, Timbuktu's Sankore University, included a library with an estimated 700,000 manuscripts. The Mali Empire eventually disintegrated in the 16th century, but at its peak was one of the jewels of the African continent and was known the world over for its wealth and luxury. One legendary tale from the kingdom's riches concerns the ruler Mansa Musa, who made a stopover in Egypt during a 14th century pilgrimage to Mecca. According to contemporary sources, Musa dished out so much gold during the visit that he caused its value to plummet in Egyptian markets for several years. Here's a photo of the Great Mosque at Djinn in Mali, which still stands today. Let me share just again as we close this segment, this video clip on Mansa Musa.
If someone asked you who the richest people in history were, who would you name? Perhaps a billionaire banker or corporate mogul like Bill Gates or John D. Rockefeller. How about African King Musa Keita I? Ruling the Mali Empire in the 14th century CE, Mansa Musa, or the King of Kings, amassed a fortune that possibly made him one of the wealthiest people who ever lived. But his vast wealth was only one piece of his rich legacy. When Mansa Musa came to power in 1312, much of Europe was racked by famine and civil wars. But many African kingdoms and the Islamic world were flourishing, and Mansa Musa played a great role in bringing the fruits of this flourishing to his own realm. By strategically annexing the city of Timbuktu and re-establishing power over the city of Gaul, he gained control over important trade routes between the Mediterranean and the West African coast, continuing a period of expansion which dramatically increased Mali's size. The territory of the Mali Empire was rich in natural resources, such as gold and salt. The world first witnessed the extent of Mansa Musa's wealth in 1324, when he took his pilgrimage to Mecca. Not one to travel on a budget, he brought a caravan stretching as far as the eye could see. Accounts of this journey are mostly based on an oral testimony and differing written records, so it's difficult to determine the exact details. But what most agree on is the extravagant scale of the excursion. Chroniclers describe an entourage of tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians, and souvenirs, and even having mosques built along the way. In fact, his spending may have destabilized the regional economy, causing mass inflation. This journey reportedly took over a year, and by the time Mansa Musa returned, tales of his amazing wealth had spread to the ports of the Mediterranean. Mali and its king were elevated to near legendary status, cemented by their inclusion on the 1375 Catalan Atlas. One of the most important world maps of medieval Europe, it depicted the king holding a scepter and a gleaming gold nugget. Mansa Musa had literally put his empire and himself on the map. But material riches weren't the king's only concern. As a devout Muslim, he took a particular interest in Timbuktu, already a center of religion and learning prior to its annexation. Upon returning from his pilgrimage, he had the great Djinguereber Mosque built there with the help of an Andalusian architect. He also established a major university, further elevating the city's reputation and attracting scholars and students from all over the Islamic world. Under Mansa Musa, the empire became urbanized, with schools and mosques in hundreds of densely populated towns. The king's rich legacy persisted for generations, and to this day, there are mausoleums, libraries, and mosques that stand as a testament to this golden age of Mali's history.
All right, let me get this closed. Okay, I enjoy this this video. It again is a I think important counterpoint to the thinking of people like Professor Burgess at Columbia and Andrew Johnson, our 17th president, who would argue that there was no civilization in the world before the colonies that would become the U.S. And obviously we know that that's not true. Let me just conclude. When we, as historians, look at stories like Mansa Musa and Kush, Great Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, there is support in the historical records. We talked about the archaeological digs and Emperor Augustus's head. This is the Catalan Atlas, and I found this in my reading from Ronald Sanders, The Lost Tribes and Promised Lands. This is a coronation gift to Charles VI of France, made in about 1375, on the island of Majorca by a Jewish cartographer, Abraham Creek. I'm mispronouncing his name, forgive me. The map is actually an enormous atlas of the world as then known. It is painted and inscribed on 12 vellum leaves and mounted on boards in such a way that it could be closed or opened out like a folding screen, nearly 20 feet long and more than 2 feet wide. And this is indeed Mansa Musa. As we learned from the video, made this phenomenal journey, and in Creek's Catalan Atlas, he captures Mansa Musa and this great journey. So I'm going to end here with our first of 8 classes. I'm ending in Africa. We will begin our second, and I'll have a couple of other comments to make, but I want to leave you again with the perspective that if we are going to understand our history today, we need to understand this history of American slavery. And in proper context, we have to understand the ancient societies that existed long before the America we know today, and how that society would ultimately be impacted by the African slave trade. So let me conclude there, and I look forward to seeing you in our second segment. Stop my recording.